Hey everyone, today we're going to be testing 3 varnishes from Orocolor. First, we have their water-based gloss varnish, then we have the water-based matte varnish, and finally, we're also going to be testing their super gloss varnish. The main reason I wanted to try these is because the labels don't specifically say that they can be used with an airbrush. They actually recommend applying them with a fine brush. But I personally like using an airbrush for varnishing, so I wanted to see how well these products actually work with one. I also tested the first 2 with a brush before recording, and they work just fine that way. So now let's see how they perform with an airbrush. The first thing we're going to do is thin them down. They're already pretty thin straight out of the bottle, but I prefer to thin them just a little bit more so they atomize more easily through the airbrush. For this, I'm going to use the thinner I made in a previous video. If you want to see how I made it, I'll leave that video here on the channel. There's also something important we need to do before using these varnishes. Shake them really well. This is especially important with the matte varnish. As you can see, there's some material settled at the bottom of the bottle. That's the matting agent that gives the varnish its matte finish. You don't see this with the gloss varnish, but in the case of the matte one, I actually think it's a good sign because it shows that there really is a matting agent in the product. So let's give it a really good shake. One easy way to tell if it's properly mixed is by looking at the little glass ball inside the bottle. If the ball can move freely all the way around the bottom without getting stuck or hitting anything, then the varnish is properly mixed and ready to use. Now let's thin it down. A 1-to-1 mix of varnish and thinner works pretty well, but the ratio I liked the most was 2 parts varnish to 1 part thinner. That gives us a slightly thicker mixture while still allowing it to atomize properly through the airbrush. I'm going to use this measuring cup to prepare the mixture. I'll start by adding the thinner, followed by the varnish. I'm making 15 milliliters in total, so I'll add 5 milliliters of thinner and 10 milliliters of the matte varnish. Give it a good mix and that's it. Now I'm going to transfer it into these small 15 milliliter needle tip bottles. These are really handy for using with an airbrush. To make sure no larger particles make their way into the airbrush and cause a clog, I'm going to filter the mixture using these little funnel filters that I made. And there we go, our matte varnish is ready to go. Now we'll do exactly the same thing with the gloss varnish. First, give it a really good shake, add the thinner, add the varnish, mix everything together, and transfer it into the 15 milliliter bottle. And that's it, both varnishes are ready to use. As usual on this channel, I also made some little labels for the bottles. Haha. They make them look a lot nicer, and they also help me avoid mixing them up. So let's cut them out and stick them on. First, the matte finish. And now the gloss finish. And that's how they turned out. Haha, I really like how they look in these little bottles. Now it's time to actually test them. For the first test, I have these 2 spoons that I painted black earlier. We'll start with the matte varnish. Before putting it into the airbrush, let's give it another quick shake. As I mentioned earlier, these little bottles are really convenient for airbrushing because of the small needle tip. So let's load up the airbrush and apply it to the spoon. After applying the first coat, this is what it looks like. I'm going to build it up with several coats. I generally prefer applying several lighter coats rather than trying to cover everything with one heavy coat. For this test, I'll apply one slightly heavier coat and let it dry. While that's drying, let's clean the airbrush. One thing I really like about this varnish is that it cleans out of the airbrush quite easily, so I didn't have any major problems during cleanup. Now let's do the same test with the gloss varnish. We'll load up the airbrush and start with a light coat. Then we'll apply a slightly heavier coat. Right now you can see a slight whitish or bluish haze on the surface, but let's let it dry and see how the finish looks once it's completely cured. And once again, let's clean the airbrush. This varnish also cleans up pretty easily, so I didn't have any major issues with it either. And here's where things get interesting. I had already recorded several tests for the finish and durability, but then I remembered that I had bought another product from the same brand a while ago called Super Gloss. I looked through my supplies and surprisingly, I still had a completely unopened bottle. So of course, we're going to test that one too. I had actually tried this product with an airbrush before, and at the time I wasn't happy with the results. It would form these little beads that could clog the airbrush, and the product would also dry really quickly on the tip. It was a complete mess. But later on, I tried it again with what was left in the previous bottle, and I discovered something important. The problem wasn't actually the varnish. It was the thinner I was using. At the time, I was using a thinner I had made with water and glass cleaner, and apparently that mixture was causing all of those problems. So in this case, I definitely don't recommend using that kind of thinner with these products. It's better to use a suitable commercial thinner, or make a proper thinner that you know works well with the product. Otherwise, you might end up thinking a product is bad when the real problem is actually the way it was prepared. I already have a small batch of the Super Gloss mixed and ready to go. I recommend thinning this varnish a little more because it's slightly harder to atomize with the airbrush. A 1-to-1 mix of varnish and thinner works well, and you can even add a little more thinner if necessary. And now let's put all three finishes to the test. Matte Gloss and Super Gloss. I'm going to apply the matte finish to one spoon, the gloss finish to another, and the Super Gloss to a third. All three performed quite well. They all atomized properly, and cleaning the airbrush was also fairly easy. The Super Gloss was a little harder to clean than the other two, but it wasn't difficult by any means. And there we go, all three spoons are painted. Now we'll let them dry and then compare the finishes. They're completely dry now, and this is what they look like. This is the spoon with the Super Gloss finish. This one has the regular gloss finish. And this is the matte finish. Starting with the matte finish, I think it works really well. It looks genuinely matte. I wouldn't call it an ultra matte finish, but it definitely doesn't look glossy or satin, and I really like how it turned out. Here we can see the reflection of a window, and how the light is nicely diffused across the surface. Next we have the gloss finish. It also has a nice level of shine. In this case, we can see the window much more clearly, although the edges of the reflection are still a little bit soft. And finally, we have the Super Gloss. Here the reflection is noticeably sharper. You can see the window lines and the light much more clearly. The difference between the regular gloss and the Super Gloss isn't huge, but there is a difference. For projects where you really want a high gloss finish, such as car bodies or similar surfaces, I think the Super Gloss could be the better option. Now we're going to do a few durability tests. These tests aren't part of the manufacturer's specific instructions, since these products are intended for crafts, mainly to protect the paint and provide different finishes. But I'm curious to see how well they hold up to some everyday situations. We're going to test three things. First, how resistant they are to scratching. Then, what happens when we use masking tape over the varnish. And finally, how they react to moisture. Of course, these results can also depend on other factors, such as the paint underneath, how long the varnish has been allowed to dry, and how well the primer is bonded to the surface. For example, if the primer isn't properly bonded to the surface, masking tape could pull the paint off even if the varnish itself is well adhered. So let's run the tests and see what happens. Scratch test. First, I'm going to use a coin to scratch the surface of each spoon. Let's start with the matte finish. The coin leaves a few small marks, but the varnish itself doesn't come off. Now we'll do the same thing with the gloss finish. Here the marks are much less noticeable, and we have to apply a little more pressure to mark the surface. And finally, let's try the super gloss. The result is very similar to the regular gloss. Even after scratching a little harder, the varnish still doesn't come off. Now let's test masking tape. I'm going to put a small piece of tape on each spoon and leave it there for a few minutes. Then we'll peel it off and see if it lifts the varnish or leaves any marks. Let's start with the matte finish. The tape came off easily, didn't leave any visible residue or marks, and it didn't pull the varnish off either. Next is the gloss finish. The tape also came off without any problems, and once again we don't see any damage to the varnish. And finally, the super gloss. The result was basically the same as with the other two. So in this test, none of the three varnishes had any problems with the masking tape. Now for one final test, moisture. I'm going to wipe the spoons down with a damp cloth, because some varnishes can soften or even turn cloudy when they come into contact with water. Let's wet the cloths and start with the matte finish. We'll make several passes over the surface and then let it dry. We'll do the same thing with the gloss finish. And finally, we'll test the super gloss. Now we'll let all three spoons dry and see if anything changes. After letting them dry, let's take another look. Starting with the matte finish, it didn't soften and the surface still feels just as smooth. Next, the gloss finish. It didn't soften either and the surface is still smooth. And finally, the super gloss. Again, we don't see any significant changes and the surface is still smooth. In this test, none of the three varnishes became gummy or cloudy after coming into contact with the damp cloth. They even seem to have become slightly more glossy, and some of the small marks we made earlier with the coin are much less noticeable. So after all these tests, what did I think of the Orocolor varnishes? Overall, I really liked them. All three can be thinned and applied successfully with an airbrush, even though the labels don't specifically mention airbrush application. I really liked the matte finish. It's not ultra matte, but it does a very good job of eliminating most of the shine from the surface. The regular gloss finish also works very well, and for me, it's the most convenient option for general purpose use. Between the regular gloss and the super gloss, I personally prefer the regular gloss for most projects, mainly because I found it a little easier to use and clean. The super gloss does produce a slightly sharper, deeper shine, so I'd save it for projects where that extra gloss is actually useful, such as car bodies or other surfaces where you really want a high gloss finish. As for the durability tests, all three performed well. None of them had any problems with the masking tape, and we didn't see any significant changes after the moisture test. Keep in mind that these are just practical at-home tests, so the results can vary depending on the surface, the paint, the primer, the drying time, and the application conditions. And one last recommendation. If you're going to use these varnishes regularly with an airbrush, you can prepare small batches ahead of time and keep them in bottles like these. I find it much more convenient to have them ready to use rather than having to mix a new batch every time I need to varnish something. So in conclusion, even though Orocolor doesn't specifically state that these products can be used with an airbrush, they worked very well for me when used this way. And if you're going to apply them with a brush, as recommended on the label, you can use them straight from the bottle without thinning. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful, and that it helped you get a better idea of how these 3 varnishes perform. Just to be clear, this video isn't sponsored or paid advertising. I simply wanted to test these products because I've used other products from this brand before and had good results with them. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and share it. And I'll see you in the next one.